know what that means. That's absorbed dose times the quality factor. So what's so new about that?
Committed? Committed to what? An institution? What does committed have to do with dose equivalent?
Oh, please. So we're effective at being committed? I don't understand why we have to go through all this.
Oh, no, you can't be serious. We're going to be totally effective at dose equivalent? Why are we changing all the things we already know?
Oh, no. Unbelievable. Look at all those new terms. What do they mean? And why are we being asked to make significant changes in the way we work around radioactivity and radiation sources? As you all know by now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for the first time in over 30 years, has completely revised its regulations regarding standards for protection against ionizing radiation. Now, these new regulations are designed to provide a framework and to establish boundaries which the NRC considers to be fundamental and essential to basic radiation protection. The new standards apply to all licensees, from large power reactors, universities, and medical institutions, to small users of radionuclides, and facilities using sealed sources, too. Understanding the NRC's new standards for protection can be difficult and confusing, or simple and straightforward, depending on how we focus on the information. And we're going to try to avoid the confusing approach here. Let's begin by taking a moment to think about the goal of radiation protection. Simply stated, it is to avoid the harmful effects that exposure to radiation might cause. Now, there are two categories of effects to be concerned with: prompt effects and delayed effects. Prompt effects are those that occur soon after exposure to very high radiation doses, like the acute radiation sickness that was first seen at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and more recently at Chernobyl. There are a couple of concepts here that are important. With prompt effects, the severity of the biological damage is directly related to the dose received. The higher the dose, the more severe the effect. And for this category of effect, there is a threshold or level below which the effect does not occur. The regulations refer to prompt effects as non-stochastic, and we want to be absolutely certain that no organ or tissue is subjected to non-stochastic effects. The second category is delayed effects, like cancer induction and genetic defects that can be inherited by future generations. The probability of delayed effects occurring increases with dose. Furthermore, in the absence of convincing evidence that there is a specific dose below which no effects occur, we assume that there is a direct relationship between the dose received and the probability that a delayed effect may occur sometime in the future. It could be years, maybe even decades later. Since these effects are random, that is, they involve chance or probability, we use Webster's word stochastic, of or pertaining to probabilities, and call these types of effects stochastic effects. Now, since there isn't a radiation dose threshold below which no effects can occur, our basic radiation protection philosophy is to keep all exposures ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. Actually, ALARA is getting closer to being a limit. In the old regs, the wording required licensees to comply with the limits and, quote, make every reasonable effort to maintain exposures ALARA, end quote. The wording in the new regulations is stronger. Quote, the licensee shall use to the extent practicable procedures and engineering controls based upon sound radiation protection principles to achieve occupational doses and doses to members of the public that are as low as reasonably achievable, end quote. All right. Now let's look at the basic concepts behind the new regulations, and not to be concerned with underlying mathematical formulations, internal dosimetry calculations, or even the exact wording of definitions used. The underlying reasons for the changes are fairly simple. First, external and internal doses should be added to describe the individual worker's total occupational dose. Second, our protection standard should reflect the changes that have occurred over the last 30 years in the basic philosophy of radiation protection. And third, updated scientific information should be incorporated into the radiation protection standards. So, it's pretty tough to argue with the justification for the new regulations. It really is time to bring our standards up to date. Before we can really understand the new regulations, we need to recall briefly where we've been so we can identify what will be different. If we look at the old regulations, we find it broken down into 4 basic categories. First, we had doses to individuals in restricted areas, which were listed in terms of quarterly maximums for the whole body, head and trunk, active blood-forming organs, the lens of the eye, or the gonads. There was also a section on hands and forearms, and one on feet and ankles, or extremities. And we had quarterly limits for the skin of the whole body. The second major section was exposure to air in restricted areas, wherein we addressed airborne radioactivity that might be inhaled by workers. Protection against internal radiation dose in the old system was based on the concept of controlling concentrations of radioactive materials to ensure that the annual dose rate to the organ or tissue thought to be most susceptible, called the critical organ, would not exceed some maximum permissible dose, even after 50 years of continuous exposure. These concentrations for each radionuclide were called maximum permissible concentrations, or MPCs. And radiation protection requirements were based on the measured concentration of radioactivity in air and water. The third section in the old regulations had to do with permissible levels of radiation in unrestricted areas. And the final category in the old regs was the radioactivity in effluents to unrestricted areas. So what we had was a hodgepodge of measures which didn't focus very well on maximum doses to individuals. The new regulations require that we assess doses to all individuals, not just measure radiation or radioactive levels. And we must ensure that dose levels to those individuals be kept as low as reasonably achievable. So we must approach the whole concept of dose limitation differently. The first category is now occupational dose limits for adults. The second is occupational dose limits for minors. The third is dose to an embryo fetus. And the fourth category is dose limits for individual members of the public. Another fundamental difference in the new regulations is the concept that if we're concerned about total annual dose to individuals, we really ought to be combining internal and external dose equivalents to come up with this total occupational dose. And this is a new concept. Previously, we didn't attempt to quantify the internal dose, but simply limited the dose to the critical organ in the 50th year of a working lifetime. That brings up another point we need to address. If we're to understand the new regs, we need to think about what we mean when we say dose, or occupational dose. What thought picture do you have when I say dose? The concept of dose is energy deposited that causes ionization. That is the stripping away from electrons from their parent atoms or molecules. But we never express dose in terms of the number of ionizations. Supposing I were to tell you that my radiation dose last year was equivalent to more than 100 quadrillion ionizing events. We have no real-world experience with numbers as large as quadrillion. The national debt is measured in trillions, and that's staggering, nearly unimaginable. Actually, the only radiation dose I received last year was from background radiation, and, it may surprise you, that did cause more than 100 quadrillion ionizing events throughout my body. So we need a more manageable method of expressing dose, and we use the more familiar units of dose equivalent, wherein we multiply the absorbed dose times a quality factor, which puts all radiation types on a biological damage equivalent basis. That way we can add a gamma ray dose to a neutron dose, to an X-ray dose to a dose from any other type of radiation. Let's take dose equivalent one step further. When we talk about internal exposure now, we must become familiar with the term committed dose equivalent. The concept here is that once you ingest or inhale a radioactive material, there's not a great deal you can do about it, and are therefore committed to that dose until it has gone through its process of radioactive decay or is eliminated from the body. So that's a new term we need to be familiar with, committed dose equivalent. Committed dose equivalent is the dose equivalent to a specific organ or tissue that will be received from an intake of radioactive material during the 50-year period following the intake. And that committed dose equivalent, the internal dose to some organ or tissue, is recorded as though it were all received in the current year. So when you hear or see the word committed, think internal. Let's add another word to this new term, committed effective dose equivalent. The word committed tells us we're dealing with an internal exposure. Dose equivalent tells us that the quality factor adjustment has been included for us. The effective part of this term is an attempt to equate an organ or tissue's committed dose equivalent to a whole body dose that carries the same risk. This requirement to add internal dose equivalent to external dose equivalent does present a conceptual problem. Think about it. If a worker's dosimeter indicates a deep dose equivalent from penetrating X or gamma rays of, say, 0.1 rem or 100 millirem, we're accustomed to thinking of that as a whole body dose equivalent, wherein all the organs in the body received 0.1 rem. Now suppose that person worked in a hospital, and their routine duties involve preparing radioactive iodine for treating thyroid patients. And the bioassay data indicates that this worker's thyroid gland received an additional committed dose equivalent of 0.1 rem or 100 millirem from the small radioiodine uptakes. How do we add these committed dose equivalents for specific organs to the external deep dose equivalent? Clearly, they are not equal on a risk basis. 100 millirem to the thyroid gland must obviously carry less risk than 100 millirem to all the organs and tissues of the body. Our computers are now programmed with weighting factors, which help us translate these internal organ doses to risk-equivalent whole-body external dose exposures. While you'll never have to make these calculations, it's probably helpful in grasping this new concept to familiarize you with the weighting factors assigned to the various organs. The NRC used the ICRP system of dose limitation, which identified 6 organs considered important in terms of cancer and hereditary defects resulting from radiation exposure. The gonads received a weight factor of 0.25, the breast 0.15, the red bone marrow 0.12, the lung 0.12, the thyroid 0.03, and the bone surfaces 0.03. The computers are then programmed to seek out the next 5 organs which received the highest exposure as a result of a particular uptake and assign 0.06 as the weighting factor for each of these organs. The computer multiplies these weighting factors times each of the 11 organ doses. It will then total all these and arrive at a sum of the committed effective dose equivalents. And this number can be added to the deep dose equivalent from external exposure to arrive at the total effective dose equivalent, which is really bottom line of what each worker receives annually. Before we leave the subject of internal or committed exposures, there are a couple of additional terms you need to become familiar with. We now have the annual limit on intake, or ALI values. This is the amount of radioactive material that will result in a committed effective dose equivalent of 5 rem. In the old system, we used the term maximum permissible body burden, but we couldn't add internal and external exposures to arrive at a worker's total occupational dose. And that's at the heart of the new regs. And we now have the term derived air concentrations. The concentrations of radioactive material in the air which, if breathed under normal conditions for a working year, would result in an intake of 1 ALI. When you compare these derived air concentrations to the old MPCs, we find that some radionuclides have stricter limits. Other limits are less restrictive, and about half are unchanged. Okay, now let's talk about external exposure a little bit and how the new regulations approach that differently. In the old regulations, we really only had two kinds of external exposure: whole body dose and skin dose. In the new regulations, we now have three categories for external exposure. Deep dose equivalent from external exposures are measured at a depth of 1 centimeter, little less than ½ inch. It's one of the calculations that the people who process our dosimeters make for us, and doesn't represent a change from the old methodology or regulations. Shallow dose equivalent is essentially the same as what we used to call the skin dose equivalent. It's measured at a tissue depth of 0.007 centimeters. And this is a new one. Eye dose equivalent is calculated at a depth of 0.3 of a centimeter. The reason we're now treating the eye as a separate category of external exposure is that we've come to realize that the eye is more resistant to biological damage than we originally thought. Okay, that should give us enough understanding of the new terminology and concepts to examine the new occupational dose limits for adults category. We have a basic change in that we no longer deal with limits per calendar quarter. We're now concerned with just the annual limit. And the total effective dose equivalent, remember, that's the internal and external exposures added together for adults, is 5 rem annually. The lens of the eye limit is 15 rem. And the skin and extremities measured as a shallow dose equivalent have a limit of 50 rem. All right, now let's discuss how the new regulations treat non-stochastic effects. 50 rem has been established as the limit for all organs of the body to avoid non-stochastic effects. 15 rem is the limit for the lens of the eye. And the sum of the deep dose and the committed dose equivalent to a given organ cannot exceed 50 rem in order to avoid non-stochastic effects. Okay, the next obvious question is, do all users have to go through this exercise of estimating internal exposures and adding them to external exposures to arrive at this total effective annual dose equivalent summation? The answer is no. Most workers throughout the U.S. work with radiation-producing machines or with sealed sources, where there is virtually no potential for inhalation or ingestion. These facilities and workers do not have to address this issue of internal exposure at all. There are other work environments where there are only trace elements of radioactivity which could potentially be ingested or inhaled by the workers. The bottom line for these facilities is that if workers are not likely to receive more than 10% of the annual limit on intake for the radionuclides in question, internal exposures do not have to be calculated. Conversely, for facilities which only expect internal exposures, if the potential for annual external exposure is less than 10% of the permissible limits, which are 5 rem for deep dose, 15 rem for eye dose, and 50 rem for shallow dose, they are not required to monitor external exposures. If you try to find the section in the new regs that addresses your specific situation, you'll have a problem. Because what we have are general radiation protection requirements, or boundaries, which apply to all classes of licensees. The NRC will eventually issue several new regulatory guides with detailed information for specific applications. Another area we need to explore are those situations where occupational dose limits may be exceeded. Under the old regulations, the basic limit we had was 5 rem per year. However, individuals could receive as much as 12 rem per year if the individual's lifetime exposure limit was not exceeded. We no longer track special exposures that way. The new concept is planned special exposures for adult workers who are likely to receive more than the occupational limits, and where alternatives to avoiding the higher exposures are unavailable or impractical. With the new regulations, there are some significant strings attached with implementing PSEs. additional exposures must be specifically authorized in writing by the licensee before the exposure occurs. The individual must be given special instructions. The PSEs cannot exceed the occupational dose limits in any year. They may not exceed 5 times the annual occupational dose limits in the individual's lifetime. And a written report must be submitted to the NRC within 30 days identifying the management official who authorized the planned special exposure, along with the exceptional circumstances and all the other who, what, when, and where details. Individuals involved must also be informed of the best estimate of the dose resulting from the planned special exposure within 30 days. So, the administrative compliance requirements, when exceeding the 5 rem per year limit, are now substantial. Now let's examine the next major category within the new regulations: occupational dose limits for minors, that is, workers under the age of 18. This one is fairly simple in that the limit is 10% of the annual dose limit specified for adults. So our deep dose equivalent of 5 rem would result in a dose limit for minors of 0.5 rem or 500 millirem. And instead of 50 rem for the skin of any extremity, the limit would be 5 rem. The third new category of dose limitation is the dose to an embryo fetus due to the occupational exposure of a declared pregnant woman. The new regulations state that during the entire pregnancy, the occupational dose to the embryo fetus shall not exceed 0.5 rem. There is a further provision stating that we should avoid substantial variation in the monthly exposure rate. In other words, we don't want to use up half of the 500 millirem in any one given month, but rather attempt to spread the exposure evenly over the entire pregnancy. The new regulations make reference to declared pregnant women. This is an important term and requires that the worker voluntarily inform her employer in writing of her pregnancy in the estimated date of conception. Voluntarily and in writing are key elements. Formal notification is really the only way to ensure that the employer has the necessary information to limit the dose to the fetus during the period of the pregnancy. But suppose the pregnant woman doesn't notify her employer until the fetus has already exceeded the allowable 500 millirem by the time she makes the formal notification. The employer is then required to limit the exposure during the remainder of the pregnancy to less than 50 millirem. And the final category of dose limitation is a new one: dose limits for individual members of the public. The dose rate in any unrestricted area may not exceed 2 millirem in any 1 hour. Now, that's not new. But the regulations now require that we conduct our business so that the total effective dose equivalent does not exceed 100 millirem in a year. This represents a substantial change from the previous regulations, which allowed 500 millirem annual exposure in unrestricted areas. So, what we see here in the new regulations is a significantly more restrictive standard with a permissible annual dose equivalent of only 20% of the previous limit. Well, before we talk about how the new regs are going to affect the workplace, I don't know about you, but I need a short break. Be right back. Before we talk about how the new regs will affect the workplace, it's important to keep in mind that in this show, we're concentrating on the philosophical and conceptual changes in the new regulations and how those of us who work around radioactive materials and sources will need to do things differently. We're going to review standard procedures that you should be familiar with and identify some of the new wrinkles for you. Now, we could not, of course, discuss all of the specific changes as they relate to every application. There are some subtle and some not so subtle changes with respect to how the new regs will impact the workplace. And we really need to begin by reviewing a few work area definitions. We know that in an unrestricted area, the radiation level is so low that it's virtually the same as natural background radiation, and therefore requires no monitoring or posting. And we don't have to control access. There are two limits to unrestricted areas. First, in no part of that area could an individual receive a total dose of more than 100 millirem in 1 year. And second, the dose from external sources may not exceed 2 millirem in any 1 hour. And here comes a new term. A controlled area is outside the restricted area, where access could be limited for any reason. In other words, if we choose to control access to a given area for reasons other than radiation protection, we now call that work area controlled and must limit exposure to dose limits for individual members of the public. No formal radiation training is required for individuals frequenting these controlled areas. We're all familiar with restricted areas, where access is limited to protect individuals against undue risk from exposure to radiation or radioactive materials. And within restricted areas, we have various categories. If the radiation level could result in an individual receiving a dose equivalent in excess of 5, but less than 100 millirem in 1 hour, we refer to that as a radiation area. Incidentally, these measurements must now be taken 30 centimeters from the source, or from the surface through which the radiation is penetrating. We have certain specific requirements that we must follow with radiation areas. The first is, of course, that we must control access. We must post these areas with a sign notifying individuals that they are in a radiation area. The sign must read in purple or magenta or black over a yellow background, "Caution, radiation area," and must include the familiar three-bladed radiation symbol. In the old regulations, we couldn't use black, and we could use the words caution or danger in radiation areas. But now we must use the word caution, and that's because at levels between 5 millirem and 100 millirem per hour, we really don't have a dangerous situation. Rather, a situation that warrants caution. But we do need to make sure only authorized individuals enter the area, and that they don't spend any more time there than is necessary. The next category is the high radiation area, which is defined as an area accessible to individuals in which radiation levels could result in an individual receiving a dose equivalent in excess of 100 millirem in 1 hour. With high radiation areas, each entrance must have some type of access control feature that prevents unauthorized entry and inadvertent radiation exposure. Basically, this treatment of radiation and high radiation areas is very similar to the old regulations. However, we now have a new category called very high radiation areas, which is an area where radiation levels could result in an individual receiving an absorbed dose in excess of 500 rads in 1 hour. This measurement is made 1 meter from the radiation source, or from any surface through which the radiation penetrates. These areas must be posted with a sign that says, "Grave danger, very high radiation area." As you would imagine, a facility must employ even more stringent control measures in these areas. For example, radiation facilities must be equipped with entry control devices that function automatically to prevent inadvertent entry. Okay, so that brings us up to date on the definitions and requirements of the different categories within restricted areas. Now let's examine surveying and monitoring under the new regulations. Surveys are, of course, an evaluation of the radiological condition and potential hazards. There is now a new section addressing instruments used for quantitative radiation measurements, such as dose rate meters or effluent monitoring equipment. These instruments must now be calibrated on a regular basis, and the records of those calibrations need to be maintained. As a matter of fact, if we look at the whole record-keeping section of the new regulations as it relates to monitoring and surveying, we can identify a variety of small changes. For example, the old requirement for keeping records and general surveys was 2 years. We now must keep those records for 3 years. There's also much new data that must be kept on committed dose equivalents to individual workers. This is new, of course, because the old regulations didn't address internal exposure. The bottom line here is that measurements or calculations that you record which indicate that an individual dose or dose equivalent was received is now more complicated than it was before. Simply put, you'll now have more categories to document: deep dose equivalent, high dose equivalent, shallow dose equivalent, estimated intake, committed effective dose equivalent, information used to calculate committed dose equivalent, total committed dose equivalent, and that's not all. Record keeping just got more involved. Sorry about that. But there are a lot of record-keeping details that the manager of your radiation protection program will need to become familiar with. Now let's turn our attention to who needs to be monitored. With respect to external exposures, all adults likely to receive a dose in excess of 10% of the occupational limit must be monitored. Minors and declared pregnant women likely to receive a dose in excess of 10% of their occupational limits must be monitored. And finally, all individuals who will enter a high or very high radiation area must be monitored. How about this whole new issue of committed or internal dose? Who must be monitored here? We need to monitor all adults who will likely receive an intake in excess of 10% of the ALI, annual limit on intake. Similarly, minors and declared pregnant women who are likely to receive in 1 year a committed effective dose equivalent of 50 millirem must be monitored. There are also some important changes in the new regulations with respect to the handling and storage of radioactive materials. The regulations state that we must secure licensed materials that are stored in controlled or unrestricted areas. And most of us interpret that as meaning that these materials must be kept under lock and key, which simply follows common sense. And of course, material that is not in storage but is in active use in controlled or unrestricted areas must also be carefully supervised. The section Procedures for Receiving and Opening Packages is conceptually the same as the old regulations. Packages containing radioactive material need to be monitored for external surface contamination. And that's really the only way we can ensure that leaking packages will be found and reported so that appropriate action can be taken. In addition, an external radiation survey is required to ensure that the source is still properly secured and shielded. Nothing much new there. However, there are some significant differences now. Certain types of packages that were exempt from monitoring requirements in the old regulations are no longer exempt. All packages labeled as containing radioactive material must be monitored. And if there's evidence of potential contamination to a package known to contain exempt quantities or articles that are radioactive, but not required to display a DOT label, these must be monitored for radioactive contamination and radiation levels. Basically, we're talking about packages that are crushed, wet, or otherwise damaged. Furthermore, the action level for removable radioactive surface contamination that can be swiped and measured has been lowered substantially. For example, the limit for beta-gamma emitting radionuclides is now 10-fold lower, and for many alpha-emitting radionuclides, it's 100-fold lower. The point here is that we're talking about significant change, and institutions that receive and monitor packages will need to examine this section of the new regs carefully and be sure that the final delivery carrier, as well as the regulatory agency, are notified whenever the surface limits are exceeded. Another area we need to discuss when we're talking about control measures is airborne radioactivity areas, where there are radioactive materials suspended in the air. If airborne concentrations exist to such a degree that an individual without respiratory protective equipment could exceed, during the hours the individual is present in a week, an intake of either 0.6% of the annual limit on intake, or 12 derived air concentration hours, that's an airborne radioactivity area. That's also a mouthful. Let's see if I can paraphrase that for you. If an individual were present in an area without respiratory protective equipment and could receive 30% of the weekly limit, that is an airborne radioactivity area. You still awake out there? Hang in. there are only two other remaining topics of the new regs we need to discuss: records and reports. There are many small but very important changes here. For example, we now need to record deep, shallow, and eye dose equivalents. And of course, we need to determine the committed effective dose equivalents and add it to the deep dose equivalent to come up with total effective dose equivalent for all individuals who are monitored by our program. One of the biggest real-world impacts of all this is that management must now develop, implement, and document a radiation protection program and review that program at least annually for content and implementation. That may not mean a great deal to the individual workers, but it represents a major change for those responsible for administration of the radiation safety program. So, I bet I know what some of you were thinking when you heard about the new regulations. Oh no, they've changed all the rules. Well, hopefully you don't feel that way anymore, and realize that while there are some new terms and concepts and procedures, the vast majority of your radiation safety program will remain largely unchanged. Our overall goal of keeping exposures as low as reasonably achievable has not changed. And the basic laws of physics, along with our use of time, distance, and shielding, cannot change. What's different? We need to learn the new system of dose limitation. And the biggest change here will be implementing the requirements for documenting external and internal dose and combining them into a total. There will be big changes in our everyday paperwork. We're going to have to get accustomed to a lot of new forms. And some long-established procedures and techniques may well change. For example, the method currently being used to monitor the external contamination of a package may not be sensitive enough to detect the new lower limits. So a whole new counting system, or perhaps a new counting procedure, will need to be developed. But for all the things that will change, you should find some comfort in knowing that the rules are changing for everybody: the worker, the radiation safety officer, the management officials, the NRC or state regulatory agencies, as well as their inspectors. We're all on a new learning curve. And remember, the new regulations and procedures will enable us to do a much better job of monitoring and documenting every worker's total occupational dose. And to that end, the inconveniences we all must face during this adjustment period will be well worth it.